The room was silent, but the tension was impossible to ignore. U.S. Senator had just finished a long and pointed line of questioning aimed directly at Pam Bondi. The implication was clear. He believed she had made serious mistakes during her time as Florida's Attorney General. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras stayed locked on the witness table. Many expected Bondi to stumble, or at least struggle to defend herself, but instead, what happened next stunned the entire room. Because when Bondi finally responded, her calm but razor-sharp reply completely flipped the moment and left several people in the chamber speechless. The hearing room on Capitol Hill looked much like any other high-profile government session. Inside the building at Capitol Hill, the atmosphere carried that familiar mix of formality and quiet tension that often surrounds congressional hearings. Long desks stretched across the front of the chamber where senators and committee members sat side by side. In front of them were neatly arranged folders filled with documents, printed reports, highlighted pages, and handwritten notes prepared by their staff. Several lawmakers occasionally glanced down at tablets, scrolling through background information or reviewing talking points before their turn to speak. Behind the main desks, aides and assistants moved quietly through the room. Some leaned in to whisper quick updates to the senators they worked for. Others handed over fresh documents or small slips of paper with last-minute reminders. Every movement was subtle and controlled, but the activity showed just how much preparation goes into hearings like this. Further back in the room sat rows of reporters and camera crews. Many journalists had their laptops open, fingers resting on the keyboards as they waited for anything worth reporting. Television cameras were positioned carefully to capture the witness table and the lawmakers asking questions. Moments like these can sometimes be routine, but every reporter in the room knew that hearings also have a habit of producing unexpected headlines. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. She was no stranger to environments like this. Before arriving at this hearing, Bondi had already spent years in public office, most notably serving as Florida's Attorney General. During that time, she had dealt with complex legal battles, high-profile cases, and constant public scrutiny. Standing before lawmakers and answering difficult questions was simply part of the job. Over the years, she had developed a reputation for remaining composed even when discussions became tense. Criticism from political opponents, challenging legal debates, tough questions from lawmakers. None of it was unfamiliar territory. Still, even experienced officials know that hearings can be unpredictable. Sometimes they move forward quietly, with routine questions and carefully prepared answers. Other times, however, a single question can suddenly shift the entire mood of the room. A comment of disagreement or a line of questioning that puts someone directly on the spot. When that happens, the calm and structured environment of a hearing can quickly turn into a moment everyone remembers. And on this particular day, it didn't take long before the atmosphere in the room began to change, because one senator was about to ask a question that would shift the entire tone of the hearing. When the senator's turn finally came to speak, the atmosphere in the hearing room shifted almost immediately. Until that moment, the questioning had followed a fairly routine pattern: brief questions, concise answers, and a steady rhythm that allowed the hearing to move forward without much tension. But the senator chose a very different approach. Instead of beginning with a direct question, he leaned slightly toward the microphone and started laying out a long series of statements. His voice was measured and deliberate, the kind of tone lawmakers often use when they want every word to land with precision. One by one, he began describing several decisions Pam Bondi had made during her years in public office. Each example was presented with careful wording, highlighting specific moments that critics had previously debated. As he spoke, the senator flipped methodically through a stack of papers in front of him. Occasionally he paused, glancing down to confirm a date or quotation before continuing. At certain moments he slowed his delivery, emphasizing particular phrases as if to make sure the significance of the point was not missed. The tone of his remarks remained controlled, but the underlying message was clearly critical. Anyone familiar with congressional hearings could recognize the tactic. Rather than asking a simple question and allowing the witness to respond immediately, the senator was constructing a narrative first. By the time he finished listing the examples, the framing of the issue would already be established. Observers in the room quickly realized what was happening. This was not merely a request for clarification. It was a strategy. By laying out a detailed series of claims before asking anything directly, the senator appeared to be attempting to box Bondi into a difficult position. If she challenged the framing, she risked sounding defensive. If she accepted it, the narrative he had just built might stand uncontested. Behind the lawmakers' desks, staff members quietly exchanged glances. In the back rows, reporters began typing more quickly, their attention fixed on the exchange unfolding at the front of the room. Moments like this often become the defining scenes of a hearing, the point where routine oversight turns into a sharper political confrontation. The room, which had been filled with the usual quiet movement and low conversation only minutes earlier, grew noticeably still. Even the shuffling of papers seemed to fade as the senator reached the end of his remarks. For a brief moment, he looked down at his notes one final time. Then he raised his eyes toward the witness table. After several minutes spent building his argument piece by piece, he finally arrived at the point everyone had been waiting for. Only then did the senator ask his question. All eyes in the hearing room gradually shifted toward Pam Bondi as the senator finished laying out his argument. The long series of statements had created a tense moment, and for a brief second the room fell almost completely silent. Instead of reacting immediately, Bondi paused. It wasn't a long pause, but it was noticeable. She looked down briefly at the papers in front of her, then lifted her gaze back toward the senator. When she finally began to speak, her voice was calm and measured. There was no hint of frustration or defensiveness in her tone. Rather than jumping straight into a direct rebuttal, Bondi chose a different approach. She first addressed the way the senator's question had been framed. According to Bondi, the summary that had just been presented left out several key details that were necessary to understand the decisions being discussed. She explained that legal judgments made by a state attorney general are rarely based on a single simple factor. Instead, they often involve weighing multiple considerations at the same time. Evidence must be carefully evaluated. Existing legal precedent has to be taken into account. Attorneys must consider the limits of the law and what can realistically be pursued in court. And in many cases, decisions must be made quickly using only the information that is available. At that moment, Bondi pointed out that, looking back at those decisions years later can sometimes make them appear far simpler than they actually were at the time. With that context established, she began walking through the specific examples the senator had mentioned. One by one, she explained the circumstances surrounding each decision. Her explanation was methodical. She referred to the legal standards that applied at the time and the information her office had available when those choices were made. Throughout the exchange, her tone never rose. She didn't interrupt the senator or attempt to match the critical tone that had been used earlier. Instead, she remained composed and focused on explaining her reasoning. Observers in the room began to notice something. Bondi did not appear rattled by the criticism at all. If anything, the longer she spoke, the more confident her explanation seemed to become. What had started as a moment designed to put her on the defensive slowly turned into something else. By carefully laying out the context behind each decision, Bondi shifted the conversation away from accusation and toward explanation, and as her response continued, it became increasingly clear that she intended to address every point raised calmly, directly, and without backing down. Then Bondi said something that subtly shifted the entire tone of the exchange. Up to that point, the senator's remarks had built a steady rhythm of criticism. Each example he presented was framed with the advantage of hindsight, suggesting that the decisions made years earlier had been flawed or misguided. Too many listening, it sounded like a carefully constructed argument designed to place Bondi on the defensive. But instead of responding with frustration or trying to counter every single example one by one, Bondi approached the moment differently. She paused briefly before speaking, choosing her words carefully. Then she pointed out a key issue with the way the KHS senator's argument had been structured. His criticism, she explained, relied heavily on hindsight. Looking back years later, it can seem obvious that a different path might have produced a better outcome. With the benefit of time, more information becomes available. Events unfold, consequences become clear, and people Bondi
naturally begin to reassess
exactly
earlier
the problem.
decisions. Officials making those decisions at the time did not have the luxury of knowing how events would ultimately play out. They were working with the information available in that moment, not with the clarity that comes years later. Judging those choices using knowledge gained afterward, she suggested, can create a misleading picture. It can make complex decisions appear simplistic, and it can imply certainty where none actually existed. Bondi then broadened her point beyond the specific cases the senator had mentioned. Disagreements about legal judgments, she explained, are not unusual in the justice system. In fact, they are an expected part of how the system functions. Attorneys, judges, and lawmakers frequently interpret the same laws and the same facts in different ways. Those differences are not signs that the system is broken. They are signs that it is working as designed. Debate, interpretation, and disagreement are built into the structure of the legal process. They help ensure that decisions are examined from multiple perspectives before conclusions are reached. Throughout her explanation, Bondi's tone remained steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appear irritated or defensive. Instead, she spoke calmly and directly, laying out her reasoning with quiet confidence. For a moment, the room seemed uncertain how to react. The shift in tone was noticeable. Even the senator appeared to pause, briefly before continuing, as if recalibrating his next question. In the back rows, reporters exchanged quick glances while typing rapidly into their laptops. They knew they had just witnessed what would likely become the defining moment of the hearing, the point where the conversation moved beyond accusation and into a broader debate about how legal decisions should be judged in the first place. As the hearing continued, other lawmakers took their turns asking questions, and the room slowly settled back into a more familiar rhythm. Staffers shuffled papers, senators glanced down at their notes, and the steady back and forth of the questioning resumed. On the surface, it seemed as though the moment had already passed. But inside the room, it was clear that something unusual had just happened. The earlier exchange still lingered in the air. A few reporters in the back rows were already typing quickly, making sure they captured the exact wording of Bondi's response. Others quietly replayed the moment in their minds, recognizing that this was likely to become the headline from the day's hearing, and they were right. Soon after the hearing ended, short clips of the exchange began appearing online. Within minutes, the moment started circulating across social media platforms, drawing attention from viewers who hadn't even watched the full hearing. Commentators weighed in almost immediately. Some argued that the senator's line of questioning had been tough but necessary, the kind of scrutiny public officials should expect when they appear before lawmakers. Others focused on Bondi's response itself. They pointed out how calm and measured her reply had been, especially considering the pressure of the moment. Instead of reacting defensively, she had taken a few seconds, carefully explained her reasoning, and delivered her answer with a steady tone. For many of her supporters, that reaction reinforced the image she had built during her years in public life. Throughout her career, Bondi had developed a reputation for remaining composed during difficult questioning, whether in courtrooms, press conferences, or congressional hearings. She often approached criticism the same way, by responding directly and without visible frustration to them. The exchange during the hearing felt like a perfect example of that approach, but for other observers, the moment highlighted something broader about the nature of congressional hearings themselves. These events are often carefully planned and highly structured. Lawmakers prepare their questions in advance, witnesses review their statements, and the entire process is meant to follow a predictable format. Yet despite that structure, hearings can quickly become unpredictable. A single question, a carefully chosen response, or even a brief pause can suddenly shift the tone of the entire room. That's what seemed to happen in this case. The moment that captured everyone's attention wasn't a raised voice or a dramatic argument. There was no shouting, no interruption, and no obvious display of anger. Instead, it was something much quieter, a calm reply, delivered without hesitation, and for a brief moment in that hearing room on Capitol Hill, the simplicity of that response carried more weight than any long speech could have. For a few seconds, the chamber fell completely still, as lawmakers, reporters, and viewers realized they had just witnessed the moment that would define the entire hearing. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the hearing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next big moment from Judicial Insider.